Okay, thanks Sarah, that was absolutely wonderful. I'm sure there's loads and loads of questions, so let's open up to the floor. We'll take maybe, do you want to take 2 or 3 or do you want to do one at a time?
We can pick up a couple, it depends how many we've got.
Okay, well there's one here.
Yeah.
Okay, first of all, that was a fantastic talk. And I mean, all the talks have been fantastic, but I thought that was one of the most stunning. Sadly, I missed Brendan's. So,
I'm sure very good.
No, it was really wonderful, and it makes me want to go home and look up your name on Amazon and see where I can get your books.
Good.
You know, but
That's the idea. I should have brought
it's true actually. Anyway. Now the question I want to ask, and in a way I'm going back, if you like, to an older thing, asking about politics in the regions, because for example you talked about the Soldiers' Wives organisation. What were the politics inside that? A bit That's the first. What were the politics?
Do you mean party politics?
Party politics.
Yeah.
Were there any party politics? What did the SRs, never mind the left SRs, did the Bolsheviks, did the Mensheviks exist? Had the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks split in these cities? How did they relate to the crises that existed? In the ordinary people you talk about, ordinary people are never just a flat lump. They're always differentiated. There's always people with more initiative and less initiative, people with more political ideas. I'm wondering how all that fits in. You know, and also finally, the question of, you talk about the Soviets, never mind the provisional government, but the Soviets as if they're something that is static. And we know, of course, at least I know from the big cities, you know, the growing radicalisation and the fact that the Bolsheviks take control of the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets in August after Kornilov and whatever. How does that work in the localities? Okay?
Thank you. I think if you don't mind, I'll answer those because they're quite big questions. Oh, thank you. I'm really glad you asked me about party politics because I did have it in as a potential section and I ditched it because I only had half an hour and I just didn't want to kind of overstretch myself trying to get through things. So the role of party politics in the Russian Revolution is something that I've written about quite a lot. What I argue is that you find that party politics tends to be not very significant at all at the lowest levels. So in village politics, you'll find that party political discourse is mostly absent. And I'm speaking as somebody who, when I started my PhD, I set off to write a history of the Socialist Revolutionary Party in 1917 in Nizhegorod province. And I was dismayed when I got to the archives and I started reading the documents from the locales because I was just like, oh shit, where's the Socialist Revolutionary Party? Where's any party? Because when local communities elected their representatives onto these committees, I can tell you what they said. They said, we choose Nikolai Efimov because he is known to us, because he is a sober man, because he has some intelligence, because he is an educated man. That's it. And you think, oh shit. Where there is party politics, certainly at village level, it's almost invariably going to be a broad affiliation with the Socialist Revolutionary Party, but not that much, but that it is there. If we go up into the urban space is where, as we know, civil society is more likely to flourish and party political presence is more likely to be more evident, particularly if there's a strong worker presence. So where there are urban workers, then you will tend to have more party political contestation. But again, you will find that party political contestation is much less than we would assume from the central narratives. So very often at regional level, I mean, Michael Melanson, who's a brilliant scholar of the revolution, he wrote a lovely article quite a few years ago called Marching Together, the socialists before 1917. And in practice, in the underground, the very small underground units of, there might have been some Social Democrats, there might have been some that describe themselves as Bolsheviks, or there might just be SDs, there'd be some Menshevik groups, often a strong SR contingent. They often work quite closely together. They shared their printing press, they shared their provocateurs, because it was a very small, tight world. Where you do get party political distinction and affiliation, it's invariably in worker committees. So that would be my kind of first answer. But again, you'll find if you look at the lists of voting to, say, provisional government committee assemblies or to the town councils in 1917, you will often get a single socialist bloc. Or in some places, the Bolsheviks will stand separately. In other places, the left SRs will split. You know, and there are these multiplicity of factions and uncertainties, depending on who's there, depending on who the local individuals might be. But that overall, you see a much blurrier and certainly not such a fragmented picture. That's the first answer. Second answer, you're absolutely right to point out the Soviets were not static, but indeed the provisional government bodies were also not static. So it is difficult to talk about them in a general sense. And they vary enormously from region to region. I mean, I mentioned Krasnoyarsk, which was a very radical, had a strong social democrat influence quite early in 1917 because of the peculiarities of Krasnoyarsk as a railway centre and as a workers' centre. Others had, you know, that they did often have. The general narrative of 1917 is that the moderate socialists fail, and that the more extreme socialists take power through the course of 1917. But that varies, I would say, from region to region. I'd be very reluctant to make any kind of big statements about it, but yeah.
Our communications, presumably they were quite poor. Would the average village have the faintest idea of what's going on at the national level?
Yeah.
They still think the Tsar was there in October?
Depending where you're talking about. So, I mean, I actually, the first chapter of my book was about the reception and the dissemination of the February Revolution. So when did people find out? And what you find is that obviously the regional centres get it first because they get it from telegrams. So the telegrams operate as a very effective network. And then the rural spaces, it really depends. Some rural spaces have very strong urban connections. And so, you know, they may have somebody working in a district factory coming back to the community. There might be telegram. The church is going to tell them eventually. So they do tend to find out relatively early. But I'm talking about central Russia here. If you go out to the peripheries, I mean, my most recent book is on Eastern Siberia. Some of those places did not know what was going on by the middle of 1917. You know, if you're talking about Yakutia up in those central districts, there would be a very, very hazy sense of what was going on. But if you're talking about central Russia, the other thing, of course, is garrisons. I mean, I haven't mentioned them. They're critical. You can't get past the garrisons. Soldiers import violence into urban space all over Russia, but they also bring news. Because where you've got a garrison, you've got a telegram connection. And where you've got a telegram connection, you've got information. So that would be my kind of quick answer to that.
Hi, I've got two questions. So the first one is on what kind of primary sources do you use? And, you know, like, of course, like, there are government reports and statistics, but obviously these things, how much do they tell us about the ordinary people, and how do you overcome that problem, particularly on the regional level? And the second question, you know what you said about what was going on the local level influencing the center.
Yeah.
And do you mean that just kind of in the period between the 1917 and perhaps Lenin's death? And because at that point, so I guess, you know, I feel like what happened was they tried to democratize, and then they're like, okay, this is not working because we're losing power, and then whatever, we're just gonna centralize the system. So you kind of had this reverse effect, and then from kind of 1930s, you just...
Yeah.
That was the end of it.
Yeah, so those are two good questions. I'll answer your primary sources first. So the kind of primary sources that I've utilised, because what we tend to lack if we're looking at lower class histories is ego documents. That is, we don't get many first-hand memoir accounts, or if we do, they tend to be very heavily mediated, so that they're often produced in the 1920s and the 1930s, and they are state-sponsored documents, so they are problematic in themselves. But the kinds of things that I read to try to get a sense of this stuff is, I read the stuff that nobody had ever looked at before because they thought it was a bit boring, which is, you know, you go down to the district and the county and district level records, and you read them, and that's where I find, you know, a file with 1,200 soldiers' wives' letters and petitions to the centre.
So they keep these letters?
They keep everything. Everything.
And you can get access to that?
Yeah. You go to the regional archive and you introduce yourself in your most polite and humble fashion and beg that they allow you access.
Well, it's just like from a personal experience. experience. My mom was trying to get information about our family
no, it
in
can
the
be
Euros,
really
and she
difficult.
didn't get anything. The archive was like, oh no.
Yeah, no,
Right.
it is difficult. I mean, I've seen, actually saw a historian, an American, come in, a very big name historian now actually, but I won't mention her name. But she'd been working in Moscow and she popped down to Kazan for a couple of days. She wanted to see what they had on her files. And she didn't go through the proper formal channels. So what I always did is I always had an affiliation with the state university, and they wrote me a letter of admittance, and then I would go in with their approval, and then I would speak to the director of the archive and humbly request, and then it would go from there. But this girl who kind of parachuted in from Moscow with her very good Russian, incidentally, they just said, no, we don't have anything. And she said, you must have something, and they went, no. And she sat in the archive and they gave her one letter in Tatar, which is like burn, you know. But anyway, that's so it can be challenging, but the material is there. And I mean, my experience, and this is, you know, obviously I did this research quite a few years ago now, but my experience is nobody gave a stuff about what I was doing. They thought it was utterly irrelevant. They thought I was a little bit bonkers to want to sit there and go through this stuff. But that, you know, you go through the Soviet of soldiers' deputies, you go through the Soviet of workers' deputies, you go through the Soviet of peasants' deputies. Use the newspapers. The newspapers are fabulous. They give you all sorts of insights about what's going on at local levels. But best of all is to get down to those local level committees and find out what's going on. But you're right, I mean, it is a challenge, because ultimately the thing that I find frustrating as a scholar, and this has been the same in the book that I've just written, which is about exiles in late imperial Russia, is that it's very rare that I get to know an individual, because actually my people, they don't leave lots of records very often. They don't give me a sense of themselves. So I have fragments, but it's difficult to build a narrative about people because you often don't get very much about them. You know, I mean, my husband, he works we're like he's the lumper and I'm the splitter. You know, he works on the centre, on Vienna, on the liberals, on these big political figures. So if he wants to know what they thought, he's like, oh, I'll just pop to their private archive and read the 15 books they read, or maybe these huge broadsheet journal article papers that they told you all about what they were doing. And whereas I'm like, well, I'm really interested in this kind of guy who's a criminal, who was exiled to Yakutsk, but I know his name, I know what he was committed for, I know he was 23, I know he had a scar on his elbow. You know, I'm kind of scraping a bit to find out about the individual. But you can find it, but you just have to admit that you are imperfect, I suppose, which is what we do as scholars, right? The question about the local influencing the centre, I think it's too big a question in a sense for me to really answer adequately here, because I'm really focusing on 1917. So I was talking really exclusively about 1917 today, but I actually think that by and large you're right. I would argue that the collectivisation programmes of the late 1920s are the final blow of the state in taking control of rural communities, actually of healing in the blood, not healing, but destroying in the bloodiest and most terrible way the autonomy of these locales, fixing the problem of the rural community and its disjoint with the state. So I think it's a good way to think about it if you think about it in the longer term.
We've got 2 questions at the front. Is there a third question we could just take for Sarah just now? Okay, so first one here, I think.
Even pre-revolution, pre-war, most of the rural areas were controlled by communes anyway. I mean, village elders in any case. To what extent did he just kind of overlay Soviets? They just changed their name from commune to Soviet, or to what extent were they different? Was the commune just called itself a working peasant Soviet later on? And to what extent do you think it's true that, certainly in the Civil War period as well, you have a situation where the peasantry didn't see themselves as necessarily white or red. It was just it was just like they didn't see much beyond their own village.
Excuse me a second, can you do first aid?
Oh my God.
First aid.
Okay, she's...
It's fiercely hot in here, actually. Oh, thank you.
So I was kind of saying, where actually, locally, they didn't see it as like white, red, anything. Some of them thought themselves as They thought that Lenin was the new Tsar. I mean, there was a sense in which they wanted their grain, they wanted to own their land, they wanted to seize the land, and they seized the land, and they weren't going to relinquish that land to the whites or the Reds. And that really is a matter of who got there first and who treated them badly and who treated them well. And to what extent do you think that is true so I'm going beyond 17 really to sort of the Civil War period, and how those local areas decided their loyalties in that dispute between two kind of oppressive forces?
Yeah. So in terms of the communes, so communes didn't operate all over Russia. They operated in parts of Russia, and they operated in different places. But certainly the communes saw a big resurgence in 1917. I mean, the commune had been challenged after 1906 by a specific set of reforms by Peter Stolypin. Not so much the Zemstva reforms, but the attempts to break the commune and to encourage private property and ownership. And so some peasants left communes before 1917, but we see a big resurgence of the commune in 1917, particularly into the Civil War period. And I think that is a reflection of a desire for protection in a period of profound economic crisis. But in terms of do people change their names? Yes, of course they do. You wouldn't really get an example of the commune. Well, maybe you would. You wouldn't normally get the commune's body calling itself something else. But there would be a committee in the village and it would just shift its name. And they'd be like, oh, we need to be a Soviet. Right, we're the Soviet Peasants' Deputies now. But because there are only a limited number of people who are able or who want to serve on these things, we have an acute shortage of people who want to serve on official organisations. The questions about where the rural population sit in the Civil War is a difficult one to answer because, as I've already said, this is a vast, diverse population. I mean, in some parts of Russia, we've got very big national agendas. You've got the Ukraine. You've got all sorts of diverse problems and challenges happening in different places. There's definitely the case that large parts of the rural population didn't want to call themselves red or white, and they didn't necessarily. Some people did though. And I suppose my colleague and friend Aaron Rettish, who's written a brilliant book on Vyatka in the Revolution Civil War period. He's much braver than me. He did 14 to 22. And so Aaron talks about this a lot. He argues that the rural population engage actively with the state, and that actually it's about a conversation between the state and the rural population, and that the young Soviet state learns how to actually come to terms with the rural population. So I'm uncertain about it. Some scholars, Donald Raleigh absolutely walloped Aaron for making that argument. So there is contestation about it, but certainly there is an argument about that. So I've been hesitant. So, and this gentleman has a question.
There was someone else, I think.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's similar to the last question. It was how much actually changes in the villages in terms of social structures? Because I've read about debates around divorce, where the Bolsheviks bring in divorce and alimony after 1917. And then you get peasants saying this doesn't work for us because we don't have money. The only way that we can pay a divorced wife alimony is if we sell the horse that we use to plough the field. So you get the impression from that things don't change very much in the villages, and that they are a conservative force after 1917, which is of course one of the Bolsheviks' problems. Do you think that's fair?
I think that the rural population is not easily categorisable. There are parts of the rural population who welcome aspects of social revolution, and there are other parts who resist it fiercely. And so I would hesitate. I think that the notion of the rural population as inherently dark or backward is a construct that's produced by states, because it's a population which isn't necessarily agreeing with them.
Yes, but are people living in a different way after 1917 very much, or not?
Well, you know what, it's difficult to say, because what happens after 1917 is the most appalling demographic crisis, because more people die in the Russian Civil War than they died in the First World War in Russia. It's horrific. We have this unimaginable, horrific famine sweeps Russia. We have huge population movement. We have tens of thousands of unaccompanied children moving across the empire. I mean, it's absolutely bloody miserable. It's one of the reasons I stopped in October 1917, is I just can't face the Russian Civil War. It's really is dismal. So if you say, oh, people living differently, yeah, they are, but they're trying to survive, actually. And so, you know, and I mean, the city's empty. The working class vanishes during the Civil War, effectively, because the economy collapses completely. And Russia in 1921, 1922 is a terrible husk of its former self. Oh God, I'm going to get this stat wrong, and somebody's going to pull me on it. But I'm not being taped, am I? I think it took. Yeah, I probably am being taped. So 20 people can write to me and tell me I got it wrong. I can't remember now. I think it took until like 1954 for the Soviet Union to get its grain production up to the pre-war levels. It really was utterly catastrophic, and collectivisation compounded that.
And World War II.
And World War II, yeah, that really, bring it on, yeah. I did go to a conference a few years ago about working class people in Russia, and it was a long view, so from the 1880s to the 1960s, and it really did feel like a kind of a progression of people hungry. They ate potatoes. People really hungry, and it just seemed to get worse and worse from the 1920s onwards. In fact, I'm going to use this opportunity of a captive audience to tell you one of my very few Russian jokes, which is two Russian men who know each other quite well. They meet in the 1910s, and he says, "A как вы живете?" which means "How are you?" or "How are you living?" And then they meet in the 1920s, and he says, "A как вы живете?" How are you? Alive? And then he meets in the 1930s, and he says, "A как вы живете?" What? You're alive? I think isn't a bad kind of summary of the situation.
Our friend is fine. She just had a little hot. A little hot, and very much sorting that out. So here I am.
Well, is the temperature okay?
Open up.
Oh, please open
Still
it.
open.
Yeah.
In fact, if we had the door open, we get the flow of air would come out.
Yeah.
Maybe
They may be out there with a.
maybe not just not quite so wide.
Okay, yeah. Flowing through. Wonderful.
You mentioned the women from Kazan marching in Moscow, and obviously the.
Sorry, they were marching in Kazan.
Oh, they weren't. Oh, they are.
Yeah,
They were
yeah.
in Kazan, sorry,
Yeah.
but they're wrong. Okay. And obviously the whole revolution starts with a women's sort of uprising in Petrograd in February, March, coming up to that amazing anniversary in a couple of weeks. And it's an incredible story of the way the women in the food queues and the various textile plants just say we're fed up. They go out on the streets and say we want the revolution now, and all the mainly male-dominated revolutionaries are saying no, we were planning maybe in May or some other time, but obviously not now. And the women just kind of say no, this is happening now. It's an amazing event, and there were two mysteries as regards this bit of history that's been troubling me. One is, I guess, the most important, which is why the women, you hinted you might have an answer to this, or beginnings of an answer. Why is it the women assert themselves in such a strong way and then fade away to a great extent throughout the rest of the revolution? And the other question really is, I came across a book by Anne Bobroff-Hadgell.
Oh, yeah.
It's very interesting. You've heard of it,
Yeah,
but I'd only heard about it very recently, called Women Under the Hunger Czars, and it's
Yeah.
an amazing anthropological attempt to come to grips with this question of why the women assert themselves across Russia, not just in Petrograd, and then kind of fade away. And I'm not going to go into the argument. But why is this book virtually the only book which really directly confronts this issue? Surely it's one of the biggest issues in social history, and we should have dozens of books by now, and there's virtually nothing. Do you have any answers to that?
Okay, I'll give it a go. So why do women assert themselves and why do they fade away? Well, there was a long history of, and particularly in the rural context, of women leading protests. So in rural contexts where there is, and it happens relatively infrequently actually because it is dangerous for rural populations to make open protests, but where there is open protest, it is often the case that women would be at the forefront of those protests, and that they might well be carrying their babies. And it is the women who would get away with a direct attack on Tsarist officials or on police officials because they can be disregarded. Ah, well, they're stupid women, they're baba, which is, like the silly old women. So they can be disregarded. And also, a threat of violence towards them is less likely, because an official would be unlikely to strike down a woman. And so what you often get in terms of in rural contestation, you would often get women in the foreground, men to the rear. And the men will often be a very menacing presence at the rear, so that you can see that women are very active participants in political process in rural contexts. And that is a well documented and well established aspect of kind of rural contestation. Another reason that women would be prominent in 1917 is because in 1917 we have economic crises which directly impact women's daily lives, and that women are most likely to be politically active in these contexts. These lower class, marginalised, over-pressured women are most likely to be politically active in contexts where the domestic sphere is being impacted, as in food crisis. So that would be my answer for why are they there. Why do they leave? That is a more complex question. I think it's connected. I mean, I make an argument about it in my book, but I argue that it's about the dominance of the formal political sphere by men. Russia is a heavily patriarchal society. Now, underground revolutionary organisations were really quite egalitarian, and they involved and incorporated a lot of women, and lots of women were very active in the revolutionary underground. But in 1917, the revolutionary underground had to grow up very quickly, and it had to engage with an electorate. And that electorate was, despite the fact that there was female suffrage, the electorate tended to tend towards men. And so there is a complex explanation as to why female representation is reduced. There's a brilliant article by Diane Kernker about women on the shop floor in the early 1920s, and she argues very compellingly that this deeply patriarchal, conservative society really reasserts itself in the face of, Soviet lip sync about equality. But actually, what happens on shop floors is that women are marginalised, belittled, and really left on the peripheries, really put back in their place, if you like. So I think that you have a very long tradition of an extremely powerful patriarchal system, which really puts women back in their places in 1917. But that's the best I can do probably in 5 minutes.
And the last question, why is it...
Why is the scholarship lousy?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that for a long time, the socialists just completely ignored women, and that and still you will get scholars telling you that, well, women aren't important because they're not politically active. Well, women are interesting if you want to talk about the domestic sphere. And there is this kind of disjoint. It is changing, but it is changing very slowly. So there is actually a book coming out in the, if you're familiar with the Russia's Great War and Revolution series, which is this very big series which is coming out a bit at a time. They're just on the home front volumes at the moment. I edited a volume with a couple of my colleagues on regional revolutions, but there is going to be a volume on gendered responses to the revolutionary period. I'm not sure what's going to be in it because the scholarship's not that rich, and there are not that many people doing it. Melissa Stockdale's done some brilliant work, and there are some particular works by particular scholars, but there isn't this depth of scholarship that you have in other fields.
Can we just add an addendum that some people will be nameless have put up a PDF copy of this book by Anne Barbara Padgell, which is utterly impossible to get hold of in university libraries. It's called Women Under the Hunger Czars. It's on at Scrib. Do you know that website? SCRIBD. So if you look up Bob Roth Padgell, Women Under the Hunger Czars, see this very interesting book. Tries to get to grips with this issue of why women appear with this.
Can you put it somewhere more accessible?
You can find it on Libcom as well.
Okay.
If you like Libcom.
I wanted to ask, I'm sorry I was late. I wondered whether, before I came in, you said anything about other regions, specifically the Saratov region. My interest is the question of the Volga Germans, who are different ethnic group to the Tatars and so on. Could you say something if you didn't?
I didn't speak specifically to Saratov, but I can, however, point you to the scholarship of Donald Raleigh, who was probably one of the very first, he was one of the pioneers of studying the regions in 1917, and he wrote a brilliant book on Saratov in 1917. There have also been some works on Volga Germans, particularly during the First World War. There's a chap called Eric Löhr who's written a brilliant study of the treatment of the Volga Germans during the First World War. So there's a couple of bits of scholarship. I personally cannot speak to that because that's not something I have done work on. Next.
Yeah, going a bit beyond 1917, I'm afraid, but one of the impressions I've had from reading various books, or generally through the former Russian Empire, is as the Civil War got underway, you had this sort of withdrawal of the countryside into itself, sort of regionally and almost down to village level. Is this an accurate kind of portrayal? Did this actually happen? The fragmentation of the country and withdrawal into smaller and smaller units, or is this one of these images that have evolved quite erroneously?
I think I would say, broadly speaking, obviously, it's a very diverse picture, and different regions will have different contexts. I would say that, broadly speaking, I would say that it was relatively accurate for the reasons that I already mentioned about demographic crisis. In a period where you have a total economic collapse, where money doesn't mean anything anymore, where the threat of violence, physical violence on your person is extremely high, then in that context of a broken society, people will withdraw and they will retreat to traditional rural structures, both to try to feed themselves and to try to protect their communities. So I would say that, broadly speaking, I would kind of agree with it. However, I would also refer to the scholarship which I mentioned of Aaron Rettish on Vyatka. And Aaron has shown us that the rural population in Vyatka, they had a very rocky relationship with the Soviet state, and there were very difficult periods through there, with forced requisition and violence and so on. But that actually, Aaron argues, in the end, peasants spoke Soviet, and that they did engage with the state. And certainly in the late imperial period, the old scholarship used to say peasants are insular, they're only interested in themselves, and that the more recent scholarship has argued overwhelmingly and compellingly that rural populations engaged with the state. So I would kind of temper, on the one hand, I think that economically and demographically these crises mean that there is going to be a fragmentation, a fracturing and a withdrawal, but on the other hand, that you do have engagement between rural populations and the state. So that would be my answer.
Just to say, if anyone's got a question in their head and you've got doubts whether it's a good question or not, get rid of the doubts and ask away. Just near here.
Okay.
You go first.
So yeah, you've talked about women spearheading the protest, but I would like to know if these protests were beyond asking for more allowance or payments, were in favor of, let's say, occupying land or occupying factories in order to ask for a worker control, something like this. And another question related with what this gentleman said. Maybe, what about I don't know if you studied about it, but what about in the east of Ukraine, that there was a very violent relationship between the state and the peasants, and they have Magno and all this stuff going on. What would you briefly explain something about that, why this conversation didn't work, or maybe it's a complicated question because they have their own characteristics.
So the question about women spearheading protests, what did they ask for? It is definitely the case that they concentrated on domestic concerns. They concentrated on their allowance, on provision of fuel, and an assistance with field work. So the predominantly rural requirements. And they also made very specific requirements based around their family situations. They tell you about their children, how many children they've got, whether they're sick or not. There's all these kind of things. They don't occupy factories. They don't march. They don't demand worker control. But I would argue, so they don't occupy what I could describe as that traditional political space. But I would argue, actually, that by asking for these basic demands, those are explicitly political requirements. They're saying to the state, we have given you our menfolk, you need to pay us back here. There needs to be a reciprocal relationship. So they speak revolutionary language, but no, they don't do those kind of things. Partly actually because soldiers' wives aren't the dominant force in factories. So you need to be in a factory, you need to be a factory worker, and you need to be organised as a factory worker if you're going to try and, for example, seize control of a factory, right? So it's the kind of tools that you have to protest politically are really dependent upon your environment, right?
And what about the land? Like, there was land occupation? Right?
Yeah, and women would have been involved in those. Again, I mean, it varied enormously from place to place as to what actually happens. It often was very much dependent on historic relationships between landowners and communities in a particular area. Some areas didn't have big landowners. Some areas had a lot of contestation between different rural communities. They were fighting over fields that were adjacent to one another, so that it wasn't, and this is where we get back to this thing about class not being very useful. It wasn't about, lower class peasants seizing land from bourgeois industrialists. It was actually lower class peasants seizing land from other lower class peasants because they were contesting who owned particular plots, right? But certainly there was lots of pseudo-legal justification for land use as well. So maybe a village community, maybe led by the commune or maybe led by a particular committee, would go to the landowner's house, and they wouldn't just torch it. They would go round politely, maybe even with bread and salt, and they would say, "Hello, sir. We brought you a document to sign. If you could just sit here and sign the document," and the landlord would be spluttering and furious because the document announces that the land is going to be transferred forthwith to the use of that community. And a large group of armed men will sort of loiter around in his living room, and he'll sign the document. And then you see the document in the record. This is where we get back to the archives, right? So you get the document in the record, and you get the note from the peasant saying, we from henceforth will utilise this property, and then you get the letter from the landlord saying, "Those bastards, they came round, they held my neck to the torch," so you've got all these kind of but that's a very interesting way, isn't it, that the rural community is demonstrating its rational capacity because it wants to avoid retribution. It doesn't want to bring down the wrath of the state upon it because that is a bad thing. It wants to try to operate within the confines of the law, so it tries the law. And so in that, there are cases where the peasants will withdraw their claim to that land. They will apologise humbly for the terrible error that they made as foolish, dark people. Never again will we do such a foolish thing. We're terribly sorry. For years, historians read that language to understand that the rural population was dark. Instead of reading it as, all right, these guys know how to speak to states. They know how to avoid retribution. They seek to avoid bad things happening to their communities. That's a surprise. It always bewilders me, this. You still get, average general histories of the Russian Revolution, or of late Imperial Russia, talking about rural populations as if they are idiots. And they are not idiots, they are rational individuals. Sorry, I've gone on a bit. Makhno in eastern Ukraine. Oh man, yeah, it's there's some really. The Civil War is fiercely complex. Whenever I teach it, my heart sinks slightly when I get my map out and start to show different regions and different spaces. Ukraine was probably one of the most violent and most contested spaces in the whole of the Civil War period. And the reasons for that are complex, but partly it's because of the numbers of contesting kind of powers. You've got the nationalists, you've got the Soviets, you've got white forces bobbing around, you've got the Germans as well, and then you've got kind of fractures within nationalist groups. You've got somebody like Makhno who might be one thing, might be another. So, and that's actually a feature. I mean, if you look at Eric Landis's brilliant book on Tambov and the Antonov Rebellion, which is kind of related to what goes on with Makhno in Ukraine, you can see that it's a phenomenally complex picture which is very much rooted in locality about what's going on in a particular community. So I'm sorry, that is a fudge, but I'm not going to say any more about Makhno because it's horrible.
Thank you so much for giving me a second bite of the cherry. When you talk, in terms of talking to power, you reminded me of Daniel Blake. You have to learn how to talk to job centre staff in the same way. Just in terms of the big Bolshevik thing was bread, peace and land, and the idea in the classical sort of left discourse would be Lenin gave the land to the peasant. My impression from what you've said, and from other reading, is that the peasants already in every little village all over, they'd already taken the land.
Correct.
They weren't given it by Lenin at all.
No.
Was the proclamation for land to the peasants, did it make any difference? Did it speed up or slow down or make any difference at all? So the fact that the peasants had just taken the land anyway?
I think it's actually rather difficult to get a sense of the national picture, and because we still don't know a lot. There is still a lot we don't know, but certainly there is absolutely no question that Lenin did not revolutionise land relations. Land relations were already revolutionised, and
from February onwards.
Indeed,
yeah.
I mean it was steadily, but building through the summer of 1917. And I mean we know that Bolshevik policy was certainly not, in principle, to allow small private landowners, petty bourgeois in the making, to have the land. This was a contingent measure. It was based on necessity. And if we want to look at all three, let's take a look at them: bread, land, peace. You know, these offers, they are fallacious. Lenin has no answer to the grain crisis. He has no better answer than the provisional government, who had very little better answer than the Tsarist state. They struggled with this, and the civil war is about control of resources. And as for peace, I mean that really is a lie. You know, that Lenin explicitly drew civil war. He brought it on. He was happy to do so.
Famine, war, and collectivisation, is it?
Yeah. So it's an ugly story, isn't it? Sorry, have I answered your question? I can't remember what the...
Well, did it speed up after the proclamation or not?
Oh, sorry, did it speed up? I'm not sure, really. I think things were pretty chaotic by then. I'm sure it will have legitimised it further.
The process is independent of the proclamation.
I think that many local processes were independent of central state declaration. That would be my sense. It certainly, it authorises it, which is, it's going to move things along, and it's going to mean that any private landowners are probably going to leave the building. People are actually going to start packing their things and getting out by this.
Odessa.
Yeah.
Simon?
Yeah. So thank you for a wonderful talk. On the peasants coming to the landowner and forcing him to sign the document, the newspaper cutting that I've been teaching my students at Canterbury Christchurch University, poor souls, and you're now probably going to tell me it's all wrong, is the one that's in Rex Wade's book, where they decide to turn the landlord's house into a school, and then some guy comes back to the village from the front. They have another meeting, and they decide, no, on second thoughts, we better burn it to the ground. And the question that I always ask the students, and which I think Rex Wade answers very convincingly, and I repeat his answer, is that this is a really logical action. That if you lived through 1905, 6 or 7 in one of those villages, you would have voted for that decision as well, once you'd heard that report from that soldier. So I suppose the question about that is, have I been misguiding my students all the time? But the other thing I want to ask you, on peace, I think that the one message which we're getting from all the very confusing messages that are coming out from the present day Russian government is that whatever anybody else thinks, President Putin thinks that the nation was betrayed from within. This is about the one constant theme from a lot of different stuff that's coming out. And I think this is really interesting. I think he's right. I mean, he says it's the Bolsheviks. What I tell my students is, as you said, the army has started walking away from the front in June 1917. So I suppose my question to you is, in the villages and in the localities, of course, the kind of finer points of all that sort of dual power stuff that's going on in Petrograd, they might not even know about it in Yakutia, or they might know about it, but it might be only vaguely relevant to what's going on over there. But I mean, the war and people coming back from the front, surely, that is a theme. And do the people in these villages agree with the people in Petrograd that it's got to finish, it's got to be unilateral, we don't care who owns what territory, we don't care about the Russian state and so on?
I mean, so to answer the bit about Rex Wade's brilliant book and his brilliant scholarship and his lovely example is that, of course those things could happen and you can find a rationale for them. And I would probably add a proviso that I would say that in the vast majority of cases, if you see violence, in a rural or an urban setting in 1917, there were almost invariably soldiers involved, because soldiers import violence into domestic space. And so that's one of the kind of ongoings of 1917, which turned catastrophic through the Civil War, where we have this real importation of military violence into civilian settings, which is just so horrible. So that's that bit. In terms of the war, I just think, I'm sorry, I sound like I'm fudging and I'm saying the same thing over and over again, but it's because I mean it. It's because different individuals within a single community would not have agreed about this. Because for some people to have seen their boys going off to war, to have lost maybe 3 out of 4 sons, they're dead or they've come back with their leg off. It's horrific beyond all, it's horrific beyond imaginings, or sadly not beyond imaginings today, but that we understand this human suffering, and that the response to that is going to be diverse. That some people will say, bugger this, let's get out of this war, who cares about all this business? Other people will say, we've sacrificed to defend our country. My son died to win this war. This is our war. And this is going to depend about your relationship with the state. It's going to depend on your geographic location. If you live near the peripheries, if you live near the front lines, you are going to care. Petrograd can hear those German bombs going off in November and December of 1917. It depends where you live, doesn't it? It depends what your relationship is. And I've seen examples in 1917, both of communities hunting down and removing deserters, really going for them, taking them back, beating them up, and also communities where deserters are welcomed quietly and sheltered. So I think that we cannot boil down these complexities of human emotion and response into any straightforward feeling about something as complex as involvement in a war.
Are there any final questions? William?
Yeah.
This young man at the front.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. You've several times compared class and these other identities. I think there's an ambiguity in the meaning of class at this time, in the sense that on one side you can have a classification of people, which would be a bureaucratic thing, an external thing. But the other thing that's going on here is a formation of class. Yeah. And I'd say that's quite an important aspect of what's going on here. And I'd want to feel of how you'd understand that. When I think of the Soldiers' Wives, which I thought was very interesting and very revealing, it seems to me that is part of a process of a formation of a class. And when I look at the relationship between the centre and the periphery, and this has come across several times, including in anti-Semitism, you have a relationship between a group and this thing that is coming about. And there's the group at the centre who think they know what it is and what it should be doing. And then there's the thing that's coming about. And you've mentioned the seizing of land, but you could also mention that when Lenin first had a plan about the economy, he didn't have the idea that workers would take over the factories. But their understanding was that, so they took them over. So that interrupted his proposal for, which would support your argument about how the centre just goes, oh God, we've got to go there next. So there's a complicated relationship between a centre and this thing that is coming about, and that actually maybe is becoming a class, maybe doesn't become one in the end, rather than a sociological thing, which I know is useful. You can say that person's working class and that person's not, but in terms of a history like this, there's another aspect to it, I think.
Absolutely. So I would be cautious, because I'm not suggesting that class isn't a useful tool for analysis, but rather I would argue that it is not the only tool for analysis. In the case of Soldiers' Wives, Soldiers' Wives are not developing a class identity in any clear way in 1917.
I disagree with you, because you said they received some form of wage, and they were arguing about it. So that's the beginning of the finding of a class relation.
One could argue that, but then I would argue that they have multiple identities. So class is one of their possible identities, but it's not necessarily the dominant identity. And class requires a certain self-awareness and recognition as a social group, which they may have. But I'm not denying that it isn't a useful tool for analysis, but rather I'm arguing that it's definitely not the only one, and that for those women, if we were to ask them about their self-recognition, they may well not regard themselves first as soldatki, but first as a land tiller from this particular province. So we have these questions of occupation and of locality, which may well come alongside notions of class. Class sits very, very poorly with exclusively rural populations. That's one of my problems with it. I mean, it doesn't work well in a rural context. It works better in an urban wage-paying context. But we can argue about it. I mean, the question about factory takeovers and well, workers kind of push it, and so Lenin has to shrug, even though that wasn't really what he wanted. Partly, but also partly actually, that again, in some areas, I mean in Sormovo, which is a factory district which I've studied, they have no choice, because the factory owners close the factory, because the factory's in it, it's not making any money, and they're capitalists, and they cannot run a factory which isn't making any money. They have poor labour discipline, they can't get the raw materials, they can't sell their stuff, they're at a loss, so they just say, we're closing the doors, and then the state steps in and says, oh shit, you can't close the doors, this is a major armaments factory, we will seize the factory, the state will have the factory. So I would say that yes, in certain cases you'll find a situation where workers' control actually defines and pushes the agenda. And then in other cases actually you'll find that the economic pragmatics of the situation drive it in certain directions. So I'm flexible, I hope, but I think that probably we have differing emphases on these things. I think this young man had a question.
Yeah, I guess just to use a kind of peace spread land paradigm, but it feels like after February and particularly after June, particularly Lenin's playing particularly with an emphasis on peace. And I was just going to ask that the kind of groups you talked about them kind of taking certain forms of direct action, like either the peasants and the soldiers' wives. I just wondered how the war came into that like were any concrete demands made about the war, and how did that time with like popular actions based on the war, like how did that play in with like other actions that were going on at the time? Because it feels to me that like in relation to land reform or specific petitions, it's very often like looming in the background. At least from I don't know, my understanding of it, like it feels to me that it would make sense that it had more of an interplay since they went to later.
So in the case of soldiers' wives tended to speak in an explicitly statist, patriotic discourse. So again, they speak state. So they talk about the language of what they've given to the state and what they expect in return. And they are unlikely within that context to call for an end to war, because they're playing their role as the loyal women who are defending the state, right? I'm not suggesting that they're not, some of them, hoping or fervently admiring calls for an immediate end to the war, but rather that they certainly don't state it. And here we get back to that question about sources, about, well, what do I know about these people? Not everything, not much maybe. I only know the fragments that they give us in documents, and that's one of our challenges. In terms of the intersections between calls for peace and either land seizure or urban action, you find it's pretty patchy actually. And I don't have an answer. I don't know. My gut feeling is that some places and some moments, certainly. I mean, I can give you an example. Nizhny Novgorod had a big garrison. All the big cities, every single one, all over Russia, they've got bloody great, massive reserve garrisons sitting in the capitals all over the empire. And these garrisons are massive, massive fermenters of social and political and cultural tension within a city. In many of these regional cities, the garrison might make up to half of the population. They're really big. In Nizhny Novgorod, by the summer of 1917, this big reserve garrison, there's this attempt to remobilise the front in June 1917. They try and send a group of this reserve garrison to the front in late June, early July 1917. They refuse, and they turn against the local community. That's the both the Provisional Government Committee and the Soviet Committee, including the Soviet of Soldiers' deputies, who were kind of going, oh shit, we've lost control of our garrison, because these are young armed men and they are dangerous. And this is again this example of where power is not easy to hold and contain and manage, and often power diffuses down to a local level. Those men were definitely calling for military insubordination, and they were calling for changes to the war, but in quite inchoate ways quite often, so they're very difficult to read. So I'm sorry I keep giving these mealy-mouthed answers, but that's because I don't have direct answers to these questions.
Folks, we're going to draw things to a close before we move to the bar, the Institute of Education bar, which you're all very welcome to come to and to continue to talk to Sarah and discuss these issues. Just before we break up, a couple of things to say. The next event in this series will be on Thursday, February 23rd, here at Birkbeck. Katie Turton from Queen's University Belfast will talk about Women in Revolt, the female experience of the 1917 revolutions. And as the title implies, Katie's going to discuss women's experiences of and contributions to the Russian revolutions, plural, of 1917. Katie's an expert on gender and women's history in the Russian Revolution, and her first book, Forgotten Lives, was on Lenin's sisters, and her current research looks at the role of women and family networks in the revolutionary movements. This will also be a brilliant event, so please come. Keep an eye out on socialhistories1917.org, the website.
Not everybody's on the internet, I've discovered.
Not everyone's on the internet, okay. If anyone is not on the internet, would they please like to come and speak to either William, Simon or myself afterwards?
Or go to your public library.
No,
or just so we can even get your phone number or something so we can contact you to let you know.
Rural Russia.
do we know where the next room is? Is it in here?
We don't know yet.
Oh, okay.
But there will be an event, for those of you that are on the internet, there will be an Eventbrite page where you can sign up. It would be great if you could sign up in advance so we know how many people are going to come, so we could try and get the biggest room possible.
I could say that I'll be here.
Uh-huh.
What would be helpful would be if at the principal Birkbeck reception desk there was a note as to where the meeting
the
is.
main
Yes,
desk.
the people on the main
no idea
desk
about this
had no idea of where this meeting might be. There is something else in the revolution.
That is singularly my fault.
No, they did.
They knew because I'd been there first.
Okay.
And so one or two other people.
Wonderful that you made it, and thanks for the
We
feedback.
blazed the trail.
Just hope there wasn't anyone else who didn't make it. A little thing to say, there's the wonderful Haymarket Books have a stall at the back here, lots of excellent titles on the revolution.
I was going to say, you said about a space about talking social events that are going on. There's currently a cleaners and support staff strike at King's University. The picket is, was today, but it's also tomorrow 5 a.m. to 5 p.m. So if anyone can get along, like send emails and stuff to the staff at King's.
Which King's building is it?
So it's the Strand campus. So it's basically against the outsourcing of the cleaning staff there, pay sick and maternity leave. So if anyone can get along or put some pressure on the union, that'd be really cool.
Excellent, thank you for that. Are there any other announcements you want to make? Along the brief, yeah.
For anyone who is interested in oral history in the post-Soviet space, my theatre group is organizing a play about Chernobyl. It's based on the book by Svetlana Alexeyevich from Belarus, who won the Nobel Prize in 2015, but people still don't know who she is. So if you're interested in in the Chernobyl disaster, how it affected people, and oral history in Belarus, in Ukraine, come along. It's going to be in the Cockpit Theatre in March.
Is there an event?
Sorry?
Is there a place for the event?
Yeah, there is. I can give you flyers. I think I left some somewhere. If you're interested, up to you.
Also on the bookstall has just been published is a reprint of, for the first time since 1956, the 3 issues of The Reasoner, the G.P. Thompson and John Seville put together, which really was revolting the Communist Party and really the birth of the new left. It's on the corner there, it's on sale at £12 instead of the usual £20. So if anyone wants to buy it, you're very welcome.
I think the last announcement.
Well, just we were asked to tell people, I think, I mean, there's these leaflets, but the day after our next talk, Paul LeBlanc has a book launch, October 1917, Workers in Power at Houseman's Bookshop, 7 o'clock in the evening, and I think somebody sent a message asking us to let everybody know.
Okay. So,
I'm assuming some people in the room will be interested that Andrew Hussey is speaking about the Arab community in France next week, Thursday, 2nd of February, in the Beveridge Hall, which is Senate House, 6 o'clock. Andrew Hussey, I mean, clearly this year, what happens in France politically is quite important.
if you are on Facebook, please look for Social Histories of the Russian Revolution. We have a page, and maybe some of you have seen it already. But the most important thing is to thank Sarah for a really sparkling and to basically speak like that with no notes is just extraordinary. So we're really privileged, Sarah. Thanks a lot. To the pub.